If I could have your attention, please, if we could all gather into our seats, we're just about ready to start. First of all, on behalf of the minister and the staff and the members here at Blount Christian, I would like to welcome all of you to this God is Not Dead conference. I'm excited about what I'm fixing to hear here in the next 3 hours. So I know you are. One other housekeeping chore I would like to do would be to ask you to silence your cell phone. Because Ken Smith said nothing bothered him any worse than somebody's cell phone going off in the middle of his speech, particularly his. Before we begin, I would like to call on the minister here at Blount Christian, Mark Howard, to offer an opening prayer.
And in case you didn't catch that, that was Dr. Bill Backus, retired professor from the University of Tennessee, that's going to be emceeing for us tonight. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we thank you for the opportunity of gathering in this place to listen, Lord, to evidence that you have placed in our world that leads us to you. I'm just reminded that the Apostle Paul promised the philosophers on Mars Hill that God established the boundaries of men so that they might seek after him and find him. And Lord, we pray this evening we might see you through the evidence that our speakers come to present. Bless each one, Lord. Bless the equipment so that we don't have any problems tonight. Thank you for those who have come. Lord, we surrender this evening to you in the name of Jesus, our Lord and Savior. Amen.
Don't be scared off by that college professor designation that Mark gave me. I'm not one of those liberal college professors because I worked in agriculture and I know how God blesses us each day. And most of us look like we've been, some of us, even overblessed. We eat too much. Our next speaker is Ray Whedon. The topic of his presentation is a rare earth. Ray has served as the Reason to Believe apologist since 1998. He is a former president of the Reasons to Believe chapter in Denver, Colorado. He has a bachelor's degree in physics with a minor in geology. Ray has worked in the nuclear field for 45 years and has a lifelong hobby of astronomy. Let's welcome Ray Whedon.
Excuse me, thank you. This rare earth is an interesting subject because you'll hear people say, well, there's billions of galaxies, and in each galaxy there's billions of stars and things. And so the question is that they say there's all these stars out there, so why can't there be other Earth-like planets? Well, it's one of those things that's not scientific, it's qualitative. You're speaking of the quality of something in an argument. It's not quantitative until you apply some mathematics to it. Well, we're going to just skim through this and apply some mathematics. Therefore, they say it has to be other Earth-like planets. And there's so much popular stuff coming out, like, well, if there's water on Mars, there must be life. Our biologists don't even have a theory now about how life came about. There is no biological theory. There's hypothesis, but it's just a humanist, naturalist assumption. Go ahead and change. So is this a reasonable scientific assertion? No, it's not. It's qualitative. It's not quantitative. And to reach science, you have to reach the quantitative calculational method. Go ahead. Evidence of statistics. There's a number of features of the Earth that if you apply quantitative probabilities to these features, I'm going to talk about 33. Now, we're only going to discuss 2 of these. I'll list some others. But if you apply the mathematics, it will prove it's not possible by natural processes to have a single Earth-like planet in the whole universe. Okay, next. The evidence of these statistics, these attributes of God constitute statistical proof that it couldn't happen, that this earth could not exist. Okay, next. Our sun is a bachelor star, meaning it is a single star without another star in orbit with it. There's what's called binary stars. They come in pairs of 2, 3, 4, 5 stars, all rotating around each other. And there's even globular clusters with thousands of stars that are in gravitational connection with each other. Why is this important? 80% of all stars in the universe are in a gravitational dance with one or the other, another star. Next. That means only 20% of the stars in our galaxy are bachelor stars. So why is that important? Next one. Here's a picture of 2 stars rotating around each other, going around a third star. That's kind of a typical thing. You'll notice that the big star is not at the center of the circle. These are ellipses, okay? So that the problem is if you have circular orbit planets that stay in a habitable zone from the star, you can't do that if you have multiple stars. Now there's a few exceptions. If you put the other star out far enough, it might. But the fact is the gravitational influence of the other star. Now, the way they rotate around each other is like, I can't even do it. In other words, this one doesn't stand still. This one rotates too. Now, if you got planets going around with each of those stars and the gravitational forces from the other star and the other planets, it's going to be a mess. Pretty much all of the exoplanets discovered, they make a big deal about that, are in highly elliptical orbits. Our Earth and the rest of the planets in our solar system, with the exception of Pluto, which is no longer a planet, and maybe Neptune, are in highly elliptical orbits, unusually. We haven't found really any substantial number of exoplanets out around other stars that are in highly circular orbits. Next. I don't know if you can see this, it's pretty light, but you see that both stars rotate around a center of gravity, that white dot on the right, and the 2 circles, well, you can imagine, represent the orbits of the stars. You can imagine a star going around with a bunch of planets going with it, and then every time they intersect, it just goes crazy. I mean, it'd be a monstrous place to live if it could exist. Next. In fact, they detect these exoplanets by what's called star wobble. And almost all of the early ones they discovered were huge planets, bigger than our biggest planet, Jupiter, because it has enough gravitational effect to make the star wobble, just slightly. You have to have very precise measurements over a period of time to detect it. But that suggests any stars, any planets around there would just be helter-skelter all over the place. So we see the habitable zone. The center one is the Earth. And they've actually illustrated that rather broadly. And the inner range there is Venus. The temperature on Venus is 800 degrees Celsius. That's enough to melt lead. So that's probably not a habitable zone. The atmospheric pressure on Venus is 65 times that of the Earth. The first time a Russian satellite landed on Venus, it was crushed by the atmospheric pressure. The one outside edge they show Mars. Mars isn't really in the habitable zone. But one problem is Mars is smaller. So who cares? And you hear people talking about this all the time. Like, well, we're going to have missions to Mars, and we'll be able to live on Mars. You can survive just like you could on the moon, but not for long. The atmospheric pressure on Mars is equivalent to 95,000 feet here on the Earth. Now, what is it called when you climb Mount Everest and you go above 20,000 feet? It's called the death zone. And you pretty much need oxygen. Around 50, 60,000 feet, you've got to have a pressure suit. At 95,000 feet, a glass of water would evaporate and your blood would boil in just a few minutes. I mean, it's just, come on, think about it. It's not reasonable. So these habitable zones are based on the gravitational effect of the sun, the irradiation from the sun. So it's a very circular thing. So as long as the planet orbits are circular and they stay in the habitable zone. But if every year they went out, now sometimes in the winter we feel it's out, or even in the summer we feel it's out, but that's, believe me, we're still in the habitable zone, even though it's uncomfortable. It's really incredibly fine-tuned. So, generation of our stars, the second attribute. Well, what's that got to do with it? A first generation star is one that's made out of hydrogen with a slight amount of helium. The material there came from the Big Bang, okay? It burns up in about 200, 300, 400 million years. And it has no heavy metals or heavy elements to make planets out of. So at the end of its 200, 300, 400 million years, it blows up. It goes through a whole complicated cycle, but it blows up and spreads matter. It fused the hydrogen and fused the helium into some heavier elements. No iron, no really heavy elements. I mean, we're talking about carbon, lithium, things like that, and boron. So then another star is formed out of the debris field of this star, and it has now some heavy elements, the lighter ones. And it goes through a long lifespan, and then it explodes at the end of its lifespan and creates another debris field. And from that comes a third generation star that has iron. Well, why is iron important? Okay, let's go to the next one. A second, that's the second generation star is made up of light elements and a rocky planet with an iron. That should be third generation star, I'm sorry. Only third or fourth generation stars can have rocky planets. Okay, they might have gaseous planets like Jupiter and Venus the second, but they don't have the rocky planets. A third generation star has all the right elements to provide the Earth-like planet. These are hot, luminous young stars of high metallicity. Anything above helium is called metal for the astronomers and cosmologists. Containing significant elements above hydrogen, helium. Next. These stars are rich in iron, which we find in the core of the Earth. This iron core is essential to having a magnetic field. Why is a magnetic field important? We live 93 million miles from the biggest hydrogen bomb you've ever seen. and it is pouring out radiation that will kill you. So there was one of the orbiters back in the 60s or early 70s that actually they had to end the mission because a solar flare set off and was headed towards the Earth. Now in the space station they actually have a shielded room that they can retreat to in these times. But you wouldn't want that all over the planet. So go to the next one. Next slide, sorry. You see the Earth here, that's North America, and they discovered with our early satellites that there was these huge radiation belts around here. And then go to the next one. Now, this is hard to see, I wish it was darker. You have solar wind coming like this, and there's the Earth, and there's these Van Allen radiation belts, but the radiation hits the shield of the magnetosphere, is driven up over the pole of the Earth and comes down at the North Pole and the South Pole. And that's why you see auroras when you go north, and you go far enough north, and they're very common. I was raised in northern Michigan. They're just a routine thing up there. You see them all the time. But this radiation is deadly for life on the Earth. But it all goes up to the North Pole and South Pole. Without an iron core, that wouldn't happen. So for complex life, anything above microbes and maybe some insects, you need this protection of the iron core. Next. Only about 2% of the stars in our galaxy are third-generation stars. 98% are first and second-generation stars. So they don't have iron cores. So between the binary and that, we combine those two numbers next. And these stars are long-lived, about 10 billion years, and that enters a whole bunch of other things that would be important to us. You can't have oil if you don't have many generations of fossils and fossil life and things like that God made. Next. Statistical proof of unique creation. Well, the bachelor star is 20%. Next. Second attribute is the third generation star necessary for planet formation for long life of the star, for iron core to shield it, and 2% there. Next one. The estimate for the number of stars in the universe is 10 to the 22. Now that's scientific notation, but it's 10,000 billion. Okay, so it basically, if you say there's a billion galaxies and a billion stars in each one, there's still 10,000 times that number. So there's more than a billion galaxies. We would express that as 1 followed by 22 zeros. And here you see that written out. 10,000 is the first 1 and 4 zeros, then 9 zeros for billion, 9 billion, so 10,000 billion. This is 10 to the 4th, 10 to the 9th, 10 to the 9th, so 4 plus 9 equals 22. That's how that works. There's no test. Okay, next. If only 0.4% of these requirements of these first two attributes, that still leaves 10 billion stars eligible. But we've got 33 of these. Now, in reasons to believe, they have over 80 of these now. This dates back, but there's no reason to go any further than 33, you'll see. So it sounds like, well, you could still have things. Well, we're not done yet. Let's consider some more attributes of the Earth-Sun system. There are 31 more attributes that we're going to talk. We're not going to talk about the 31 attributes, but the following is a partial list. Galaxy type a type of spiral. The problem is elliptical galaxies, which constitute most of the galaxies in the universe. 90% of them are elliptical, 10% are spiral. The stars are too close together. You don't want to be near other stars because they reach the end of their life and they explode. And when a supernova goes off, it can blow matter off the surface of your planet. I mean, it's not radiation that will overexpose, it's radiation that will singe and burn everything. The supernova rate and proximity is too close. And next. Here's the type of galaxy that we are. Milky Way is a SB type. And really 10% is the spirals. But we're this type, which leaves a lot of space. Next. So here we see a model of our galaxy. It has a barred center and these arms that swing out. Our sun is between the arms. And there's other places you could be in between the arms, but most of the stars you couldn't be near. In the center of the galaxy, there's a massive black hole. And they're starting to think maybe all galaxies have a massive black hole. When you approach a black hole, it's a very dangerous thing. If you get within its gravitational field, a steel sphere would melt because of the gravitational force. And there's nothing you can do to get back out, you know. But the problem that we're concerned about is other stars coming by too close and disrupting our planets and throwing the planets all up. It'd be like a pinball machine. We don't see those much anymore, so I had to think about it. You know, where just bang, 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 because these planets jump out of orbit when they jump out. Can you imagine if Jupiter jumped out of orbit and hit the meteorite field and started knocking those around, and they come in out towards the Earth, I mean, we wouldn't survive more than a year before massive collisions. Next. Okay, some of these others and the probabilities, rotation period of the planet, 10% likelihood of having the rotation period we do have. The Earth used to rotate faster. Well, what's the problem with that? You just have shorter days. The wind speeds on the Earth are driven by the rotation of the planet and thermal heating. On Jupiter, a typical day would be 500 miles an hour of wind. Okay? You can't stand up in that. Is there some kind of life that might exist? Yeah. But it's a gaseous giant. The sun doesn't even get down to anywhere. There is no surface. Surface gravity, escape velocity. Why is that important? Venus is slightly smaller than the Earth. Okay? But it has this heavy hydrocarbon atmosphere and has 800 degrees Celsius. Well, if the Earth is bigger, it has enough gravity to hold those hydrocarbons. Why doesn't it? Because of the moon. We have a large moon that strips that away. Well, okay, what if we were a little smaller? Well, Mars is a little smaller, but there's no water. The gravity doesn't hold the water down, it just leaves. So the polar caps in Mars are created by carbon dioxide freezing, not water. So we got the greenhouse gases, atmospheric transparency, star mass, distance from the parent star, and there's a whole discussion on each of these. Go to the next one. 10, 11, and finally star light spectrum. Think about it. They say, well, big stars would work, but too much radiation. The bigger the star, the more radiation. The smaller the star, the less the visible light. The visible light, if you go to the infrared, photosynthesis doesn't work. You have to have the right spectrum for photosynthesis to work, which is the basis of our food chain. You gotta have plants, plant food, thickness of the Earth's crust, and seismic activity. The combined probability of these 33 parameters equals 1 chance in 10 to the 42nd. Now, how many stars do we have? 10 to the 22. The difference between those is 20. Okay? Next one. So this is an illustration of 1 chance in 10 to the 42. There's 10 to the 22 stars on the Earth, or the difference between 42 and 22 is 10 to the 20th. There's 1 chance in 10 to the 20th that this planet would exist. A second Earth-like planet would be 1 chance in 10 to the 42 by natural processes. Now, God could create as many as He wants. We don't know about it. But it can't happen by natural processes. This Earth cannot exist. The title of this talk was the Rare Earth. I named it after a secular book by astronomers who said this planet's very likely to be very rare for this same kinds of arguments. What's the other one, the Christian one?
Privileged planet.
What?
Privileged planet.
Privileged planet. There's a Christian version, which is much better, but I wanted to say, well, there are secular scientists that think quantitatively that no, this is a fool's paradise in all this talk. It's not science just to talk about something. You have to apply some mathematics to it. So the chance of this occurring is very, very, very unlikely. Actually, it's impossible. Questions? It's a lot to cover. I usually cover it rapidly in an hour and 15 minutes. Yes?
10 to the 22nd stars. That's kind of a limit. I feel like there's a lot more than that because the universe, if there's a limit on the number of stars, there's a limit to the size of the universe,
Well,
which there isn't.
There is.
There's a limit to the universe.
Oh, yeah, because it's created. See, the term Big Bang came from oil.
Where's the edge of it?
Talk to me after. That's a really complicated subject, but there is no edge.
Okay, another thing.
Because it came from an infinitely small point, which is the exact description of ex nihilo, out of nothing, God created it, Every point in the universe is the center. Every point is exact center, because it all came from one point. And in fact, it's not just an explosion of mass and energy in space. The space itself came from it, and time came from it. And the Bible's the only holy book that talks about before time began. That's not a concept that would occur to man.
The tiny speck that exploded into the universe, God made that speck, or where'd that speck come
He
from?
spoke it into existence. We don't know.
Why did it have to come from a speck? I mean, the Big Bang is something that blows my mind.
We'll talk about that a little
Yeah.
bit.
We're going to talk about that more.
It's coming up.
Because that would be total chaos.
Yeah.
Thank God it's a little bit more.
No, it's not chaos. The term big, well, you're going to talk about the Big Bang phrase. Okay. Any others? Yeah.
You hear on the news that scientists have found Earth-like planets. What are they talking about?
They haven't found Earth-like planets.
Well, that's what they're saying.
They found planets that are within 20% of the size of the Earth and are the right distance from their star. Is their star have the right spectrum of light? Is it the right size star? A lot of them are not the right size star. You know, they couldn't support photosynthesis. Is the planet rotating slow enough? Does it have an iron core? They don't know. They just know its mass and its orbit. That's all they can tell from this wobble. And that's very complicated to do that. Okay. Who's next?
Well, at last we've seen some parameters that are larger than the national debt. By the way, how many tens to the what power is the national debt? You can think about that and answer it after a while.
17, 10, or 12.
That's pretty deep. I'm glad my PhD wasn't in that area. I'd never made it. Our next speaker is Dr. Kevin Birdwell. The topic of his presentation is the Big Bang cosmology. Dr. Birdwell has worked for 25 years in the Knoxville area as a researcher in meteorology, paleoclimate, and environmental change. He is a volunteer Christian apologist and visiting scholar with reasons to believe in Covina, California, and speaks on topics focusing on Earth history, paleoclimate, and environmental change. He holds an Associate of Arts from Central Bible College, Evangel University, a Bachelor of Science and Master of Science from Murray State University, and a PhD from the University of Tennessee. He's also a part-time professor with Lee University and a lecturer with the Church of God. Let's welcome Dr. Kevin Birdwell.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Wasn't sure how well I could read that monitor there, so. Okay. So I want to talk about Big Bang cosmology. And there's, first of all, let me just start off with what the Bible says. The Bible says that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. So the Bible is saying here, and actually probably in about 40 more places I could show you if I had time, that the natural world and creation is actually shouting God's handiwork to us. So this is important to keep in mind when we start to look at the Big Bang. And another thing I want to mention about the Big Bang is it's really named inappropriately. What you have to understand is that when the Big Bang was discovered, and really it would be better if we call it a highly designed or highly fine-tuned creation event. But the fellow that Ray just mentioned a minute ago, Fred Hoyle, was a scientist who did not like the idea of the Big Bang because Fred was an atheist, and he realized that if there was a Big Bang, that meant there was a beginning. And if there was a beginning, there must be a beginner with a capital G, or a capital B in his case. But anyway, that's where the term comes from. So while there are theories in science that we may consider to be in conflict with Christianity or maybe misunderstood, the Big Bang is probably not one of them. And so you may hear me refer to it as a cosmic creation event. It's the same thing, really. But when Fred Hoyle coined the term, it stuck, and so we still refer to that today. Now, the next slide is Einstein's theory of general relativity. And so what I want to explain to you is, why do we know the Big Bang exists? Why do we know there was this cosmic creation event? Einstein's theory is up there, and I won't try to explain it to you. It involves four-dimensional tensor calculus, so it's very complicated, unlike his special relativity theorem that everybody knows equals mc squared. But in the early 20th century, he began to develop this, and he realized pretty quickly that it implied that the universe had a beginning. And he even actually, when he realized that, he put a fudge factor in there of sorts, a constant, to try to avoid that solution, because back in his day it was generally taught that the universe was eternal, and that's in some ways how they got around the idea of there being a beginning, and this is how they got around the idea of God. So just keep that in mind, that Einstein himself did not like the idea that the universe was eternal, or it wasn't eternal. But his friend Edwin Hubble came along and explained to him that no, your original idea was correct. We see the galaxies spreading apart from each other just like we expected them to. And that's kind of what I have illustrated there. Now, a little bit later on, Stephen Hawking, next slide please. Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose, around 1970, came up with the theorem of the space-time theorem of general relativity. And it basically has two conditions: that if the universe contains mass, and if the laws of the universe are governed by Einstein's theory of relativity, then the universe itself must be finite, and time and space are even finite. In other words, they came into existence at the cosmic creation event. And it establishes that there is a cause responsible for bringing the universe into existence. Well, I did mention a moment ago that Einstein's theory of relativity is today the best proven theory in all of general relativity, is the best proven theory in all of physics. Something like the 15 places of the decimal. So this theorem is well established. Now, what are some other evidences that we have for the Big Bang or the creation event? The universe's photo album, for example. Hubble telescope helped us a lot with this. Since the Big Bang predicts that nearly all galaxies form at about the same time, and since galaxies change appearance dramatically as they age, images of portions of the universe at progressively greater and greater distances should show changes in appearance and type. And this is exactly what was verified by the Hubble telescope and other telescopes. The further you look into space, you're actually looking back into time, because as fast as light travels, it takes a very long time to get across the universe. The universe is very, very large. I've heard some estimates as large as 90 billion light years. Okay, so that means it would take light 90 billion years to get across of it, in theory. So as we look further back in time or in distance, we see galaxies packed closer and closer together, and they have a younger appearance. In other words, they change their appearances with their age. Now, another big discovery was the cosmic microwave background. And this was predicted in 1948 by Alpher and Herman, and it was confirmed by Penzias and Wilson in 1965. They found the background temperature that was close to what expected, and they found the cosmic microwave background. Now, this is a picture of it here, a representation of it, but basically what it is when the universe reached a point where light was able to separate, and the light could move freely, the photons could move freely. So this is an imprint left over from the creation event. But it actually is about 380,000 years after the creation event. Okay, next slide. The ratio of photons to baryons. Amazingly, The ratio of photons to baryons, and baryons is a term for normal matter that we talk about, exceeds 100 million to 1. This means that the universe is so entropic, in other words, that it radiates light and heat, that it can only be explained as a rapid expansion from a very hot, dense state. And that's from Smoot, 1983. So this is another evidence that we had this very hot, dense creation event. Now, going on to the next slide, another major discovery was made around 1991. The temperature uniformity of that cosmic microwave background varies by no more than 1 part in 1 to the 10,000. And this uniformity is best explained only if this background radiation arose from an extremely hot primordial creation event. That was predicted in 1984, but it was confirmed spectacularly in 1991 by the Kobe satellite, which measured this microwave background, and again in 2001 by the WMAP satellite. In fact, the leader of this Kobe project in 1991, George Smoot, said it's like looking at God. And one of the other astronomers there complained that his astronomer buddies were rushing off to get religion, joining the First Church of Christ of the Big Bang. Now, as time has progressed, go on to the next slide, we have improved our satellite measurements and been able to see this more and more finer detail. One of the things that needed to be found was that the microwave background radiation should measure about 1 part in 100,000 in its variation, which would allow for the formation of the galaxies and superclusters of galaxies that we see. Next slide. The creation of the universe. Now, how does this relate to the Bible? Well, first of all, the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And there are 2 interesting words there. The word there for create means to create something brand new that didn't exist before. So it's a very strong create word. Not every word in Genesis 1 is that strong of a create word. And also the term heavens and earth is the Hebrew term shamayin eretz, which is essentially like a compound word, like we would use, say, butterfly. Doesn't mean butter or fly. In this sense, the heavens and earth term means God created the universe. There really was no single Hebrew word for universe. Now, you see there on that diagram, you have the creation event and then this very significant expansion there at the beginning there, and it's labeled inflation. And I'll explain a little more about that in a moment and why that's necessary. And the thing that you need to understand, too, about the Big Bang is, even though it may have been this very small, dense area at the beginning, in a way it's kind of misleading to think of it as a point, because it's a multi-dimensional, it's the space that we know is on a 3-dimensional surface that's expanding on some even higher dimensionality. So the best way maybe to think about it is a balloon. If you drew a bunch of galaxies on a balloon, you would see those galaxies, and if you started blowing up the balloon, they would expand and they would get further apart from each other on the surface of the balloon. But yet the origin, when the balloon was just very small, you can't reach that. In other words, our universe is on the surface of that balloon. You could think of it that way. But we can't get to the point where it started. In a sense, the point, so I can't take you to some point in the universe that says, oh, the universe began here, because it really kind of began everywhere from our perspective. That's probably the best way I can think of to explain it, because we're not able to put in our minds a dimensionality that's higher than 3 dimensions. Okay, next slide. Another thing that was predicted and that was found by the 2001 WMAP was that there should be a certain abundance of helium-3 and helium-4, deuterium, which is a heavy isotope of hydrogen, and lithium in the universe, and we found exactly that. And it's also in 2001. So this is another confirmation of the Big Bang or cosmic creation event. And it's important to note here that this also confirms that the universe is comprised of approximately 4% ordinary matter. This was kind of a surprise, that the things that we are familiar with, like gases and stars and planets, only make up 4% of the universe. I'll get to that in a little bit more. Inflationary theory. Inflationary theory was introduced to explain some of the initial clumpiness that occurred when the universe was less than 10 to the minus 32 seconds years old. So we're talking about at the very first instant, there was this massive expansion that was far greater than the speed of light. Now realize here I'm not talking about the moving of things in space faster than the speed of light, because that can't happen. I'm actually talking about space itself being expanded at an extremely rapid rate. And there were a couple of problems that the inflationary idea explained. First of all is, why is the temperature so uniform throughout the universe? Because if the universe is this big and we only have the limitation of the speed of light, then the temperature couldn't have been that uniform, because the energy would have never been in contact with each other across the universe. Inflation explains that because of the rapid expansion of space. It also explains, why is the universe so flat? Now, what do I mean by flat? And this is a little tricky to visualize, but we all know that in math, parallel lines never intersect each other. And in a flat universe, that's true. They don't intersect each other. But if our universe was closed, like that sphere there, then you theoretically could go in one direction, and it would be a very long time, but you would come back in the opposite direction and come back to the same point. That's a closed universe. And in that case, the parallel lines get closer together gradually. In an open universe, they do just the opposite. But in an open or a flat universe, there's not really a defined boundary, so to speak. Well, space would have been very curved when it started, but yet inflation seems to have straightened it all out and made it flat. And so that was another thing that inflation predicted. But it's been very hard to establish whether inflation is true. But the WMAP, next slide. The WMAP satellite in 2001 did find when it analyzed the cosmic microwave background, it did find a certain type of angles of those differences in light that was expected if inflation occurred. So that was at least a hint that it was there. Now this year, there is something that was discovered it's still being debated and still being verified. So I can't say this with absolute certainty yet, but if it is confirmed at the end of the year, which it probably will be at a conference in December, there's a certain type of light that's emitted from this cosmic microwave background, and it's something called B-mode polarization, and I won't try to go in and explain all of that. But think of it like this. When you're looking at water going down a drain in a bathtub, it's twisting and it's twirling. That's kind of what the B-mode does to this light. And they were looking for this light, and they appear to have found it. So this, if it's confirmed, is going to be a really big confirmation of inflation theory. But there's some debate going on right now whether they've properly filtered out the dust effects of the galaxy when they're looking in the sky, because these are very finely tuned measurements. In fact, that's why they do them in Antarctica, because they need the atmosphere to be very pristine, very clean, free of water vapor, and Antarctica is one of the few places in the world that you can do that. Okay, next slide. So what does this all have to do with the Bible? Well, all Big Bang creation event theories have three major predictions in them. First is that the universe had a finite beginning in time. And as I said, this was a new concept to non-theistic scientists around the beginning of the 20th century. But yet the Bible, in many places, talks about the beginning of time. The universe is expanding. That's another prediction of the Big Bang. We have observed that from science. And again, there are many verses in the Bible that said that very thing, and were written down thousands of years ago. And finally, that the universe is running down energetically. You can also find that in the Bible. Now, I've heard a few objections to the Christian faith, even though the Big Bang seems to comport very well with the Christian faith. And one of those is, why is the universe so big? And it's a little hard to see there, but that's a picture. That background picture is the Virgo supercluster. There are over 100 galaxy groups in that Virgo supercluster. And within each of those galaxy groups are many galaxies. The one in the middle there that's labeled red, local galactic group, is ours. Ours consists of the two large galaxies, Andromeda, the Milky Way, and many other smaller ones. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is the size of the universe. The Virgo supercluster is 110 million light years across. Take that long for light to traverse it. So when you drill down into the minute part of that is our galaxy, you still have a galaxy that's 100,000 light years across. And then you have to drill down into a very minute part of that to get our solar system, and a minute part of that to get to our planet. So in a sense, if you're looking at the Virgo supercluster as our, let's just say it was our planet, we would be like an amoeba on our planet. So that's the scale of this. And yet, if we go the other direction, if we go bigger, we find out that the Virgo supercluster is just a small part of a huge universe. Now, if you really want to get a view of this, there is a National Geographic picture that I can tell you how to get. In fact, I have it on my office wall that illustrates all this. So, why is the universe so big? I mean, if God's mainly concerned about us here on this planet, well, for one thing, it's the mass density. In other words, the amount of mass in the universe is very important for getting the right gravitational force. And as Ray alluded to, the amount of gravity is very important. If our planet had just a little bit more gravity, it would hold on to some rather nasty gases that would be poisonous for us. If it had a little less, it would not hold on to the water. And those types of effects, we could probably spend all night talking about effects like that affect the ability for the universe to support life. To give you an illustration, if the universe was an aircraft carrier, and we knocked a speck of paint off of it, just a little speck of paint, that's what we're talking about. When we say 1 with 60 zeros behind it, we're talking about something like as minor as that would make the difference as to whether the universe could support life or not, just based on this gravitational force effect. And the universe needs to be that large with that much mass in it in order for us to have the right gravitational constant. Now, I don't have time to go through other examples of that, but that's just one example for you. Now, go on to the next slide. What was a little bit of a surprise as we have discovered things about the universe is that there is this thing called dark matter. As I mentioned earlier, less than 4% of the universe is real matter, or matter that we're used to seeing. But 22% of the universe is dark matter. We cannot see it because it doesn't interact with electromagnetic radiation. There have been some hints at detecting it. There are some very complicated ways of trying to detect it, but that's still in the process. But we can detect its effects gravitationally, and so we can map out where it is. And so here you see a picture. The purple area is the dark matter surrounding this galaxy. And it's actually, there's a lot more dark matter out there than there is ordinary matter. And then there was this thing called dark energy. What we found out is, and we still don't know a lot about dark energy, but what it does is that it's not matter, but it's a property of space from what we can tell. And what's important about that is it's another incredible fine-tuning parameter. Dark energy has the effect of the opposite of a rubber band. If you think about stretching a rubber band, it tries to pull back together when you stretch it. Well, space does just the opposite. If you stretch it, it has this effect of stretching out even more. So it's like the opposite of a rubber band. But here's the incredible thing about it. It has to be fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120. So it's even twice the precision of the gravitational effect and the mass density of the universe. So I think Dr. Ross has an illustration where he says that if you add or remove one, like something equivalent like a small coin from the mass of the universe, then you're outside of this precision. So that's when you think about the entire mass of the universe and taking, let's say, a quarter out of it, or throwing one in and messing things up as far as life being able to exist, that's pretty amazing. And Sir Fred Hoyle, that we mentioned earlier, said that the odds of us being here by chance are worse than the odds of solving a Rubik's Cube blindfolded, to put it mildly. So even he realizes the problem. So moving on to the cosmological argument, this is just an illustration showing you that as scientists have studied the universe, as recently as the 1890s, they suggested there was no beginning to the universe. And then they realized, hey, there is a beginning. And so then comes the question, is it caused or is it not caused? And that was basically solved around the 1950s. And so now, in our day, we're debating whether the cause, or if God is personal or not. Now, according to Romans 1, he is personal. So how are, let's say, non-theist scientists trying to deal with this? Because the evidence is so overwhelming for the beginning having occurred. Well, this is where we get into multiverse. And again, I don't have a lot of time to go into it in depth, but if you have a naturalistic model, in other words, a model of the universe that doesn't involve a God, then it has to be self-contained. That is, it can't accept a true beginning of the universe or a high-level unexplainable design. I've showed you a few of those things. Race showed you a few. And by the way, I believe the chance of the Earth now is up to like 10 to the, with 800 zeros behind it. So it's really gotten worse from an atheistic perspective anyway. But even if you have a multiverse, and there's different types of multiverses, but the one I'll mention is, I think, what's called a level 2 multiverse. And basically it's this idea that there's some type of physical mechanism out there beyond our universe that blows these bubbles, if you want to think of them that way, that just creates universes. And so there's this idea that there could be many universes. And the idea is to try to explain away all this design we've been talking about. The problem is we don't really know if there are other universes out there. And it is questionable about how much we're ever going to be able to know about them. But if they do exist, the idea is that, oh, well, there could be a gazillion universes out there, and we just happen to be in the one that's the lucky universe. And so this would explain why everything just appears to be so designed. The problem with that is when you do that, you pay a really high price. And one of those high prices is that you explain away science. You can no longer do science if you really accept that. Why do I say that? Because science is based on testing, observing, drawing conclusions, and it has everything to do with probabilities of something being likely or not. Well, if you say this about the universe, then you could say this about anything that you want to test. And say, well, maybe this just happened because we're in the right universe. So a lot of scientists have realized that, and they don't want to go down that road. And we know science works. And really, science finds a better home in Christianity. And it's no coincidence that science started within a Christian worldview. Because science, what does science assume? It assumes that there's a consistency in the laws of physics, that they're fixed, and therefore you can do testing. Well, if you had many gods in the world, why would you expect the laws of physics would be all the same? Or if you had no God, why would you expect that? You would just expect chaos. But if you have one single God who is unchanging, well, then that's very consistent to have consistent laws of physics, so that you can do science. And then also, if you accept a naturalistic origin, such as, humans evolved, but they didn't evolve for any particular purpose or reason, then why should we trust our brains? Why should we trust our brains are able to identify truth from non-truth? We really have no basis of assuming that's true. So, and also, finally, the multiverse itself would have to have some type of beginning. Stephen Hawking, as brilliant a scientist as he is, he's trying, along with many other scientists, are trying to reject this idea of God, even though the discoveries seem to be pointing in that direction. So in essence, what they try to do is they either try to make the multiverse into God with a capital M, or they maybe make the universe into God. But by the time you get down to all of these design effects that are so highly fine-tuned, 1 part in 10 to the 60, 1 part in 10 to the 120, it's very hard to see how that would be some type of impersonal universe or impersonal multiverse that's creating us our universe and allowing for us to be here when, you got that high of a precision. Dr. Ross likes to say in reference to the dark energy factor of the 10 to the 120 that, he compares that to the most well-designed human instrument, and he says that that one design parameter is 10 to the 96 power more finely tuned than the best known human instrument, which is a type of telescope. And then he goes and says that this one design parameter is a trillion better designed than man's best attempt at design, and that it's that much better funded than the U.S. government. And I think that's a good illustration. And so let's take you back here to the Bible for a moment. I mentioned those verses about time, and I'm not going to read through all of these since I'm probably already over time. But you see how many ones here. For example, Titus 1:2, a faith and knowledge resting on the hope of eternal life, which God, who does not lie, promised before the beginning of time. What you may not realize is that there are very few religions in the world that talk about the beginning of time. Most religions put the concept of God within space and time, whereas the Bible puts the concept of God outside of it. God created space and time. The only ones I'm aware of that have this concept in them are Islam and Mormonism, and in both cases they borrowed it from the Bible. And then in the next slide you have the universe is expanding. Again, I'll just give you one example here. Isaiah 45:12, it is I who made the heavens and earth and created mankind upon it. My own hand stretched out the heavens. I marshaled their starry host. You'll find probably something like a dozen references to the expansion of the universe in the Bible. Amazing this was written there thousands of years before the Big Bang was discovered. And then even that the laws of physics are fixed. In Jeremiah 33:25 and 26, the Lord says, if I have not made my covenant with day and night and established the laws of heaven and earth, and in some versions say the fixed laws of heavens and earth, then I will reject the descendants of Jacob and David my servant, and will not choose one of his sons to rule over the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for I will restore their fortunes and have compassion on them. He's saying two things in this verse. He's saying he is eternally committed to the Jewish people, to his people. But he's also saying that that commitment is as strong as the fact that the laws of physics are fixed. So finally, just a summary of biblical predictions here. Time has a beginning. Matter and energy have a beginning. The universe displays design. The universe's design is for the benefit of man's existence. The universe has a transcendent cause, a cause from outside of itself. And the laws of physics were fixed from very early in the universe's history. So these all agree with what is popularly known as the Big Bang, or we might refer to as a cosmic creation event. So I don't know if I have any time left, but if we do, we'll...
2 minutes.
Okay. If we've got a question or two, we'll try to take that.
Hello. So I hope you don't mind me asking a question on behalf of others. This isn't really my own, but I hear it all the time at conferences. So I've heard physicists say, cosmologists say, that current Einsteinian physics only goes back to, or only accurately describes the laws of the universe back to what they call Planck time. And prior to that, there's so much energy and density that we would need an accurate quantum theory of gravity. But the problem is we don't have a good quantum theory of gravity, so we can't. So it's up for grabs to say what happens prior to that Planck time. So why can we infer a beginning then? I think it's the end result.
Well, that's true, and that really goes back to the multiverse idea, and that is really at this point the limit of what science can see. So what I'm telling you is what we can see with science points to a beginning, and the multiverse really isn't a solution for that. You're basically left with either you make the multiverse God or you make a personal God. And the fact that the universe is so well designed, I don't think that the fact that we can only go back to Planck time, I don't really see that as changing that any. There are limits to science at this point, and there are things that we may be able to discover about multiverses. But I think I would make this prediction, and that prediction is that just wait and watch what direction discoveries go in. In the 15 years that I've been paying attention to this kind of thing, I have seen the evidence for design get stronger and stronger and stronger. And you would expect that if the alternative was true, that if there was no beginning, no creator, then it would go the other way. It would become more chaotic. But that's not happening. But yes, you are correct. Planck time is basically as far back as we can go scientifically, because science observes the physical. And at least from our standing right now, that's as far back as we can go physically. And the only other thing I would add to that is, whether you're talking about the universe itself or the multiverse, either one has to have a beginning. Because if you don't have a beginning, what you basically have is what's called in mathematics an infinite regress. The idea that you can never traverse infinity. So, in other words, if the universe was infinitely old, we could have never went through an infinite number of years to get to today. So that's the two things I would say about that. I don't know if any of the other apologists would like to chime in, but okay, well, I think we're out of time here, so.
Okay.
Don't you wish you were that smart? I like simple things. I'm kind of a simple fellow. My wife will attest to that. But I have a simple definition for science. He talked a lot about science. And I defy anybody in here to say that this definition doesn't fit. Science is nothing more, nothing less than man's discovery of the wonderment of God. Does that suit you? I like that. You can't name any discovery that doesn't fit that. You know, sometimes, and I heard this story, I have to tell you, about how out of the mouths of babes come great truths and simple solutions. The story goes that this Cub Scout group was visiting the sheriff's office, and he had a lot of pictures of criminals up on the wall. And the little Cub Scout said to the sheriff, "Those are mean men, aren't they?" And the sheriff says, "Yes, they are, and we're going to catch every one of them." And the Boy Scout, or the Cub Scout, says, "Well, why didn't you catch them when you took their picture?" So, you know, sometimes logical answers are hard to come by. You know, the wonderment of it all is, though, that God, who is so great, that created all these things that our speakers have talked about, looks down on me, so insignificant on this earth, and knows how many hairs I've got on my head. He even knows how many I had yesterday and how many I'll have tomorrow, which is 3 different figures. But have you ever looked down from an airplane at about 40,000 feet? You can't even see people down there on the earth. You think, great day in the morning. I used to be one of those, and I will be again in a few minutes. But God knows about us all. And I don't understand it all, but we serve a wonderful God, a wonderful God. And we've seen some of the wonderment of it all, so to speak. At this time, we're going to take a break, but before we break, I want to remind you that we have some tables in the back with information on them that you can visit about and look at. And also, you're free to visit with the apologists. I need to point out to you, for those of you that aren't familiar with our facility, the restrooms are on the right as you go out through the foyer, both men and women. So we'll be back in here, reconvene in about 25 minutes at 8 o'clock sharp. You know, it's like a Hollywood production. Lights, camera, action. Take your seats. While you're getting your seats, I have 2 things to announce to you. One is that Ken Smith will be doing an apologetics class at Dodson Memorial Baptist Church sometime in September. Date's yet to be announced. And if you haven't gone through that course, I would I would definitely recommend it to you, because Ken, as you saw tonight, is an excellent teacher, and you have a chance to interact quite well with him. The other thing is that Dr. Hugh Ross, the Reasons to Believe guru, I'll call him that. I won't call it to his face, but he'll be here in this building on October the 12th. And I have no excuse to forget that, because that's just one day after my 80th birthday. So I should remember that if my wife will write it down. Okay, our next speaker is Ben Stiles. The topic of his presentation is the problem of evil. He is pastor of the Niles Ferry Baptist Church in Greenback and has been drawn to apologetics since his seminary days. He holds a bachelor's degree in religion from Samford University and a Master of Divinity degree from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Since then, he has studied apologetics at Biola University, and he has a passion for getting people into the Bible. He has authored a book entitled Journey Through the New Testament, and his understanding of the problem of evil arises from both in-depth Bible study and personal experience. Ben and his wife Jean have 2 sons, Daniel and Nathan. Good biblical names. Let's welcome Ben Stiles.
I don't even know what I'm doing here. I mean, it's not like you even know who I am. You prayed and believed your whole life. Never done anything wrong. And here you are. You're the nicest person I know. I am the meanest. You have dementia. My life is perfect. Explain that to me.
Sometimes the devil allows people to live a life free of trouble because he doesn't want them turning to God. Their sin is like a jail cell, except it's so nice and comfy, and there doesn't seem to be any need to leave. The door's wide open. Till one day, time runs out. The cell door slams shut. And suddenly, it's too late. Who did you say you were?
I like her answer, but what I'm focusing on tonight is a little more his question. His question, explain that to me. Explain that. Explain why I'm the evil one, and yet I'm blessed. You're good. That was his mother, Dean Cain's character, probably, if you're familiar with the movie, the most evil character there. It's the challenge. And the truth is, since the beginning of time, at least we understand it, certainly since the days of Job, people have wrestled with the problem of evil. Thousands and thousands of pages of books have been written to deal with it, and I've got about 17 and a half minutes now. I'm going to explain it to you right now, speaking facetiously. And I am a pastor. I'm the only pastor, non-scientist here, I guess, but I do have actually my because I usually go more than 18 minutes. I will try periodically to look at my cell phone.
Based on biblical teaching, Christians believe that God is just and good. Christians also believe that God is, of course, omnipotent. That is, all-powerful. If God is just and good, the situation in our minds seems like it should be reversed. The meanest person should, of course, have the dementia, the nicest having the perfect life. Or at least that's what we think. And if God is omnipotent, then certainly God could do it. We would thus expect him to do that. So it presents a quandary for us. It's philosophical and theological. It's a problem for those who believe. The problem, as it's kind of stated here, I'm sorry, I wear one of these every Sunday and it still drives me crazy. But the problem, God is not good and doesn't care whether his creatures suffer. That's one possibility. Obviously, we don't believe that. But if God is malevolent, then no big deal. Or the second part of the situation, next slide there. The second potential resolution, God is not all-powerful and is therefore incapable of preventing suffering. Rabbi Kushner, a Jewish rabbi, wrote a book stating essentially that God is loving and good, but he's not all-powerful, therefore he can't stop everything. But as believers, we struggle pretty deeply with that. We don't believe either of those. Or three, and this is the atheist response, there is no God and suffering is random and meaningless. Those seem to be the three possibilities that we see from a rational perspective. John R. W. Stott, one of the leading theologians, wrote this about it. He said, the fact of suffering undoubtedly constitutes the single greatest challenge to the Christian faith. Its distribution and degree appear to be entirely random and therefore unfair. Sensitive spirits ask if it can possibly be reconciled with God's justice and love. We're taking a 180 here, going from scientific apologetics to dealing with some of the philosophical challenges and things like that. So bear with me on this. But while theistic people, that is people who believe in God, do struggle with the problem of evil, atheism has an equal and opposite problem. And with our natural bent to look at the negative, to see the evil in the world, that's what we see on the news, what we hear, and this week's been, it's been full of it, hasn't it? We rarely consider it, but it's a challenge nonetheless. And the challenge is simply this: the atheist has the problem of good. They have the problem of good. In a godless world, where do we come up with the ideas of good and evil? By what basis can we call anything good or evil? Tim Keller, a pastor in New York City, writes, he says, if you are sure that this natural world is unjust and filled with evil, you are assuming the reality of some extra-natural standard by which to make your judgment. Extra-natural, supernatural. You're assuming there's something out there beyond yourself where you can say that C.S. Lewis, when he was an atheist, said, I struggled deeply with the whole problem because I could either say there wasn't a standard or I could say it was just my own subjective viewpoint. And if that's true, then that's irrelevant too. To even say there's a problem of good and evil is to say there's a great challenge there. Someone wrote, the atheist argument presupposes a higher moral lawgiver. There's got to be some reason we call something good or evil, and it has to be some higher moral lawgiver. Secondly, if good actually exists, where does it come from? Most people would say that evil is a reality. Many would say good is. Some atheists might say, well, there's no true altruism. It's all mixed with selfish motives. But most would say there is good, there is evil. Go back a lot of years, about 15 centuries, to St. Augustine. He said, if there is no God, why is there so much good? If there is a God, why is there so much evil? Thus, the challenge that both theists and atheists face. There is a problem both ways. Again, this is going to be extraordinarily brief, like each other person's was here. But first, why does evil and suffering exist in the world? And obviously, we take this from Scripture to determine that initially, evil existed because of the choices of three beings. Two human beings, we call them Adam and Eve. One spiritual being called Lucifer initially, and now we know him as Satan. The Bible talks in Ezekiel 28:15 about the fall of Lucifer, that this very high angelic being created by God decided he wanted to usurp God's role. God did not allow that. He fell. Scripture's talking about a third of angels falling with him. And there was an evil choice. I was reading an article this week even about kind of how to, where did Lucifer come with evil? It was within himself. It was his own choice as well. And then through his temptation, but through their willing choice, Adam and Eve then chose to disobey God by eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that brought sin and all of its effects and consequences into the world. But that brings up a real question. Why doesn't an omniscient, omnipotent God, why doesn't he stop evil before it began? Or at least why didn't God nip it in the bud? Or maybe better yet, why didn't God create a world without the possibility of evil and suffering? God's all powerful. Couldn't he do that? The answer is yes, God could have done that. If and only if God wanted a world that was loveless and robotic. If he wanted a world of creatures that would obey his every whim, that would not respond with any emotion, that were just robotic, he could have us praising him, robotically. But not with love, not with that possibility. He could have created us without free will, without the ability to choose. But what kind of world would that have been? We value our freedom very highly. We as Americans, maybe more than most. What would a world without freedom and freedom of choice be like? Real love only exists in an environment where it is possible not to love. Where there's a choice to love or not to love. A love relationship cannot exist unless there is free will. So that's the challenge. I know there's a lot of questions in there we won't get to tonight. But that's the challenge of God creating a world with free will, with the possibility of evil. God did not create evil, but he did create it with that possibility of occurrence. What causes most of the evil and suffering in the world? Maybe I should say much of, but I'll say most. And you can sum it up in two different things. First, personal choices, whether they be mistaken choices or sinful choices. Personal choices, mistaken or sinful. And they have physical, relational, theological, and psychological consequences, or some measure of all of those. Think about it. Somebody's driving 100 miles an hour down a road. They fly off the road at a curve. They slam into a tree and they die. We go, oh, that's so sad, but that was so dumb. We feel sorry for the parents or relatives or the spouse, but we can kind of understand that. The person who is a lifelong chain smoker gets lung cancer, and we're sad for them and their family, and we minister to them, but we understand that. It's a cause and effect situation. A father who abandons his children later when that child is grown, he wants to reestablish a relationship with that child, and that child says, no way. Sad, again, we understand it. Cause and effect, consequence. A drunk driver is eaten up with guilt over running into and killing a teenager while he was under the influence of alcohol. That's a psychological effect. So there's physical, relational, psychological effects there. Generally, we don't struggle that much with that particular kind of suffering. But the second one, a little more so. Somebody else's or another person's choices, whether, again, they be mistaken or whether they are sinful choices. My wife and I had the privilege a few weeks ago of going to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. If you're ever there, take the 3 or 4 hours. It will haunt you, but it will be very powerful to you. Tens of millions of people were killed in Europe during World War II because of Hitler's megalomania. One person, granted many others with him, caused that kind of evil and suffering in the world. Bring it a little more forward right now in Israel and Gaza, ground war, all the things there. There's lots of ways to look at it, a lot of issues, and I'm not trying to even begin to look at that. But yet, choices of people, maybe through thousands and thousands of years, have caused suffering for others. Malaysia, my wife and I were saying, I couldn't remember if it was Flight 17, but the Malaysian Airlines plane shot down purportedly by a Russian SAM missile. 295 people, one American citizen, are dead because of the actions and choices of others, mistaken and sinful choices. A child who faces sexual abuse as a child may be traumatized for life, psychological consequences of another's sin. We struggle a lot more with this kind because it seems to affect innocent people. We wrestle with that because innocents are hurt. And I would say much, if not most, suffering in the world can be attributed one way or another to these two causes. I would say probably most, but there is something we struggle with even more, don't we? We struggle more with the areas of meteorological and geological things that cause suffering. The things that are totally apart from ourselves or others. Tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, lightning, floods, storms, droughts, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. Some diseases even could be included here. And we call that, or philosophers call that, natural evil. It seems to occur naturally. Now I know scientists like Kevin over there can explain how many of these events occur, and I'm enough of a weather nerd. I like to try to figure out the vortex and all that kind of stuff, and I don't know it near as well as he does, so I won't even try to begin that, but they can explain a lot. They are better and better. Predictions are better and better to prepare us for when something like that's going to happen and how to prepare for it when it does. But to this point, very few of those can actually be stopped or altered by science. But now if God is good, if he's all powerful, why doesn't God prevent these types of tragedies? That's the toughest of all forms of evil and suffering that we have to deal with because it seems so random. On about April 30th of 2011, my wife and I drove to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where I grew up. And we witnessed my church that I grew up in, the sanctuary I was baptized in and all that. It now had a sunroof because of one of the massive tornadoes, the massive tornado, the EF4 tornado that came through Tuscaloosa, Alabama. My church was destroyed. I haven't been to see their new building. But it was destroyed in an act of God, insurance companies would say. Sometimes it's even worse than seeming random. It may seem unjust. The bar down the street might survive while the church is destroyed. The Bible doesn't say a lot about the subject, but let me give you a place where it gives one really good hint. And it's a hint that at least for me speaks pretty strongly about this. Romans 8 verses 20 through 22. I've excerpted a little bit, mostly for space, but it says the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay. That sounds like second law of thermodynamics, isn't it? Entropy. Bondage to decay. The whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Now, what does all that mean? What do those words frustration and bondage to decay and groaning like a woman in childbirth awaiting something special, but right now in a lot of pain and struggle? The fall of man, many would interpret this, set in motion the destructive natural events in the world. According to this view, natural evil is ultimately the result of sin. Now, the truth of the matter is we can speak philosophically, theologically about the problem of evil a lot, but the truth of the matter is it comes down a lot like the professor in God's Not Dead, who ultimately pushed to the wall by Josh, I believe was his name, said, I don't believe in the God who allowed his mother to die when he's 12 years old. I want to accept a God like that. And I think for many, that is the greatest struggle. It's not theological, it's not philosophical, but it's personal. Even if I know those truths, when I or someone I love is hurting, it doesn't make it easier. And one of our close family members went through some very life-threatening illness that I battled with back in the late 90s for about 5 years. And I understood at that point what had been philosophical for me became very, very real. Those who struggle most, I think, with this issue are those who have dealt with it personally. Last question, can anything good come from suffering? Can suffering in any way be redeemed? Something good made out of it? Just 5 things as we're getting toward the close here. Some pain prevents greater future suffering. Some kinds of pain prevent greater future suffering. I ran away from home once as a child. I was 9 years old. I made it to the end of our dead-end street. Why was I running away from home? Because Mama said I had to go to the doctor, and I didn't want to go to the doctor. Why didn't I want to go to the doctor? Because these doctors had these things called shots. I finally actually my mother, I allowed her to take me to the doctor if she would beg the doctor not to give me a shot. And he said he needs a shot of penicillin. And she very quickly said, can we have it in pill form? It'll take longer. I didn't care. What would that shot have done for me? That shot would have killed something that could have potentially killed me. A little pain does that. I do not remember the man's name. There was a missionary who worked in a leprous country, a missionary doctor, who said the big problem with leprosy is that they feel no pain. And without having a pain sensation, and as gruesome as this may seem, a mouse or a rat could come in, and the person who has lost feeling in their finger, the mouse learns by the response or no response, and they may wake up the next morning without a finger. Why? Because they can't feel pain. A little pain would have prevented a loss of a limb or loss of an appendage. Suffering can also build character. Romans 5:3-5, one of my wife's favorite scriptures, talks about the fact that suffering produces perseverance, endurance, character, hope, and love. It can produce, if allowed to, something much better in us. Suffering, thirdly, gives us the ability to comfort others who suffer. I have sought to minister to alcoholics and addicts. I thank the Lord I have never been in their shoes. But I have noticed a former addict or a former alcoholic they will listen to a lot faster than me. Because they can empathize. I can sympathize, but they can empathize. Fourth, suffering leads many people to God and the ultimate escape from suffering. Oh yes, many run from God in suffering, but many run to God in suffering. And then they find that ultimate escape from suffering, which comes in the future, in eternity. For the Christian, suffering will be redeemed in eternity. 2 Corinthians 4:17-18 say, for our light, this is Paul writing, later in the book in chapter 10, he gives a litany of all his suffering, of beatings and all the other things he faced. But then he says, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. If you put it on a balance, our earthly sufferings, no matter how bad they are not as heavy as the eternal glory Paul is writing. He says, so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary. What is unseen, that's eternal. That's what is forever. The suffering is temporary. Now, I think if we search diligently enough through both the Bible, through experience, through philosophy, other things, we will begin to find what I would call pieces of the puzzle that give the answer to suffering. Now, are all the pieces there? No, there's a lot of pieces missing from that puzzle. They'll never be found this side of heaven. However, and we've just talked about a few pieces tonight. However, when we get more and more pieces together, I think a picture becomes or begins to be revealed. And that picture is simply this. It's a picture that we can ascertain that it's probably a cross and there's a man on it that we call Jesus. And I think in the longest run of it all, the man who suffered the most, who suffered what he did not have to, is the Lord Jesus Christ. I think that is the biggest piece, the biggest part of that puzzle. That's all I have to share, so I would be open for questions now.
Hi. I actually have a comment, if that's okay.
Sure.
That
scares me a lot less than a question.
Well, I just wanted to say, God really does use people suffering. 5 years ago, I attempted to kill myself through a massive drug overdose over a really bad relationship. And the doctors actually did say I should have died. And that it really was a miracle that I survived. And through that situation, I did meet my now husband, who really, he's a godly man, and he has taught me so much about God, and God really uses situations that seem like there's no hope, and he gives you hope through those. So.
Amen. Thank you. That's a better testimony than what I've said over the last 20 minutes. Anybody else? Okay.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure. You got 5 minutes. At least according to my cell phone.
I have the time, you don't.
That's right.
One thing that bothers me as a nation, we have turned our morality into a moral cesspool, put it very bluntly. How patient is God going to be with us? Are we going to all have to go down to Egypt, start tromping straw and making bricks before we turn back to Him?
It's a good question, and one, obviously, I don't have the right answer on that one.
I'll throw a little something out here for you, too, to think about. If there were no suffering, then wouldn't this be paradise? I mean, seriously, people wonder, well, why didn't so-and-so get healed or such and such get taken care of in a favorable way? Well, if everything we prayed for was answered in the positive way, then, this would be paradise. And of course, we're not living in paradise, right?
Not yet. Not yet. Thank you.
You got one here?
Okay,
Well, I have a comment too, I guess. I was just thinking about, I read the life of Corrie ten Boom, and I think she was in prison for 10 months, but it's like she was content to die and give her life, and but through that suffering, God, she probably never dreamed. I'm sure she didn't dream of what God had for her after she left prison, and then we today can learn from her life. And anyway.
One thought from the sermon I heard by Tony Evans or somebody, I can't remember, but he said, God cannot use a man greatly until he has broken him greatly. And I want to say no, Lord. No. But I think there's some truth to that.
I just want to make one brief comment. I think that follows up with some of the others here is I find it interesting that in Western culture, where most places we have it, quote, easier than the rest of the world, we sit around and complain about suffering. But yet in the parts of the world where there is true suffering going on, they seem to be more willing to turn to God. I don't get that, but just thought I'd throw that out there.
That's good comment.
One more.
I just have one more thing. I was watching a video of Joni Eareckson Tada recently at a conference, and she said that, when just before her accident had happened, which made her quadriplegic, she's for 38 years, she said that, she had prayed to God for a closer relationship with Him, to do His will for her life, and she said she had no idea, what that meant. And she said, though, she would not trade her quadriplegia for anything, because that is what, that pain and suffering is what brought her to a very close relationship with God. So,
thank you.
It's been my observation down through the years that be you Christian or not Christian, suffering is going to come into your life. But the most dramatic difference is how you react to that suffering. Just go to a funeral where the person who died is not a believer and observe the family. Pretty tragic. But then go to a funeral where the person has lived a godly life, and it's a celebration. And we've had several of those here at our church, with some of our godly people have gone on to their eternal award. Our final speaker of the night is David Brock. The topic of his presentation is critical thinking. Professor Brock taught at Johnson University for 8 years. He founded the Reasonable Faith chapter in Knoxville, Tennessee, and has been an ordained minister for almost 20 years. He has served as an assistant director of the Ratio Christi chapter at UT Knoxville alongside Ken Smith. His higher education trail includes a BA work at Atlanta Christian College, MA work at Emmanuel School of Religion, and PhD work at Toronto School of Theology. He is an author, a publisher, an elder, a worship leader, and a former radio station DJ and news director. Let's welcome Darris Blount.
All right. Get a little height on that thing here. Critical thinking, what is it? Well, it's something that we all do a little bit of, but not always necessarily enough of. We often know how to analyze things in common situations and determine the truth of a matter. Well, for example, I have 4 children. My youngest daughter is also the youngest child, and when she learned to write, she would write on everything. Walls, tables, bedposts, it didn't matter to her. She was the only one of our 4 kids who had this penchant to write on absolutely everything. And what we did was one day we discovered that her name was scrawled across the tabletop or something of that nature. And so we looked to her and we said, "Kira, who wrote this?" She looks up at us and says, "Alex." So we applied our parental critical thinking skills and we came up with the following. Alex was 9 or 10 years old. He had never written on things. We knew it was not his handwriting. We recognized this as her handwriting, and we knew about her compulsion to write on things. Therefore, we knew that she had written on the tabletop. It wasn't exactly rocket science, but it is critical thinking. Now, reasonable faith is a ministry of Dr. William Lane Craig. He has 2 PhDs, one in philosophy and one in theology, and he is engaged in high-level critical thinking. In fact, the title of his ministry, Reasonable Faith, was chosen because of his conviction that faith in God is a reasonable thing. Most atheists and skeptics will proclaim that belief in God is unreasonable, that it's really a silly, archaic, pre-rational belief based on no real evidence whatsoever, and it reflects just a vague hope in some mind of a believer. Well, they will hold gatherings to that nature. They had one in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago called the Reason Rally, a celebration of secular values. They tend to view themselves as free thinkers, although I would argue with that. They have websites, they have rallies, conferences, groups, and so forth dedicated to disabusing people of their faith in God. And to them, God really is dead. He is an old-fashioned notion from a pre-scientific age that only existed because ignorant people didn't understand the world around them. Now, these people can be extremely persuasive. Many of them are academics who teach in colleges and universities, as portrayed in the movie God's Not Dead. There are plenty of stories about college students who lose their faith because they encounter ways of thinking that they are simply not prepared for and equipped to deal with. And we even have stories of professors and yes, even pastors who give up the faith because they suddenly run into questions that they can't answer themselves. Dr. Craig says one of the saddest statements that he hears is when he speaks at churches and places, he'll have some distraught parent come up to him and say, "Oh, if you had only been here a year or 2 ago, my son or daughter had questions like this, and no one here could answer them, so they left the faith to become an atheist or an agnostic." So it is really important in our churches and homes that we begin to learn critical thinking as it applies to the Bible and the existence of God. And it's really a shame and a disgrace in many ways that we spend nearly 2 decades raising children only to have them leave the faith because they encountered some question or problem that they were not prepared to deal with. And it's also a shame and a disgrace to find pastors and other church leaders who have spent years in higher education leaving the faith because no one has taught them how to critically think about these matters. They don't know about the resources that are out there and ways that we can help them. I want to talk about fallacies. I keep hearing this popping sound. Is it me? Am me see what's going on. I have no idea about this thing here. Low battery, that's what it says. So if you want to bring the handheld mic, I can deal with that. I think my old radio days. He's got one here too. All right, there we go. Take this off and get out of my way then. Never used it.
It's on.
All right, there we go. I've never used a microphone like that, so the first time I do, it gets to die on me. All right. Let's look at some fallacies here. One of the most powerful tools that exist in the atheist toolbox is that of emotion, as we have talked about and our previous speaker and Ken Smith led us into as well. Those of us who deal with atheists a lot find that emotion is far and away the number one issue that drives people away from God. And let me give you just an example here. This slide says, "Yelling at a bud won't make it bloom. Speak gently to our children." Now, this slide has a lot of emotion to it, especially if you were one who was severely yelled at as a child. But when you look at it critically, you realize that it's really comparing two things that are totally unalike. A flower is a plant. It has no ears, and I assure you, even if you yell at it, the bloom will still blossom. Children are human beings. They do not blossom at all. They grow and they learn and they respond to stimuli. And every parent has to yell at their child at some point, and it may be just to stop them from running into the street. But they do have to yell at them at some point. You can put up the next slide there. Easy, okay, all right. It's not that important, but anyway. The child, though, will still grow up well enough, even with an occasional yelling at. In fact, the basketball, football, or soccer coach does not have an issue with yelling at your children. In fact, it is thought that yelling at the child actually makes the child a better, more disciplined player. So strictly speaking, it's a false or fallacious statement. But it is an emotional statement for people, especially people who were raised in a verbally abusive household. And in the movie God's Not Dead, Kevin Sorbo's character of Jeffrey Radisson struggles with emotional pain, this pain of losing his mother at the age of 12. And this made him hate God, which is actually an irrational position, since it doesn't make any sense to hate someone who doesn't exist. And the Josh Wheaton character ultimately points this out to him. Radisson's thinking apparently goes something like this: my mother was sick. I prayed to God to let her live. My mother died. God didn't prevent her from dying. Therefore, there is no God, and I hate him. You probably know people, though, who have had these similar experiences through the issue of suffering. And people who are in this kind of emotional pain, like Jeffrey Radisson's character, often don't think clearly or logically about their pain. Radisson never considers that humanity sinned, that pain and suffering are a product of that sin, and that death is the ultimate consequence for all of us because of it. And it doesn't matter to such people if someone else is in more emotional pain, because their pain is their central focus and driving emotion of their lives. They often don't realize that everyone goes through pain at some time in their lifetime, and many people do so with their faith in God perfectly intact. And nor do they consider that God allowed Jesus to go through a short life and a painful death. And so we find out that emotion is a very, very difficult thing to overcome, since it's so often impervious to reason, thought, and analysis. So you may need to do other ministry work with a person like this to work them through the pain before you can deal with the logic of their objections. And sometimes pain is hidden behind other facades, and we saw that again in the movie as the Radisson character hid his emotional pain behind his education and his bravado. Why else do people take up atheism or agnosticism? Well, everyone who does apologetics can come up with a list for you. Eric Hyde has come up with a list. This is what he calls the top 10 objections. Number one, there is no evidence for God's existence. 2, if God created the universe, who created God? 3, God is not all-powerful. If there's something he cannot do, God cannot lie, therefore God is not all-powerful. Believing in God is the same thing as believing in the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Christianity arose from an ancient and ignorant people who didn't have science. Christians only believe in Christianity because they were born in a Christian culture. Why, if they'd been born in India, they would have been Hindu instead. The gospel doesn't make sense. God was mad at mankind because of sin, so he decided to torture and kill his own son so that he could appease his own pathological anger. God is the weirdo here, not me. History is full of mother-child Messiah cults, Trinity Godheads, and the like. Thus, the Christian story, well, it's just a myth like all of the rest. The God of the Bible is evil. A God who allows so much suffering and death can be nothing but evil. And evolution has answered the question of where we came from. There's no need for ignorant ancient myths like this anymore. Now, if you got any chills up and down your spine because you didn't know how to respond to one of those objections, and I just saw a list this week of 50 such objections, then you're in need of some education and some practice in critical thinking skills. Every one of these objections is used, and any one of them can be effective if a person is not prepared to deal with it. So what critical thinking does is help you analyze a statement and point out its strengths and its weaknesses. And let's look at a couple of these questions here and see how we can answer them. Objection number 6. Christians only believe in Christianity because they were born in a Christian culture. If they'd been born in India, they would have been Hindu instead. That seems very reasonable. Well, this objection has some influence on people because most of us do not do extensive research into other religions to determine if they are true. So in some regard, Christianity is the easiest choice to make. But, this objection commits what is known as the genetic fallacy. One of my favorite fallacies here, genetic fallacy. It attempts to say that what you believe is not valid because it came to you as part of your cultural heritage in this case. The origin of the fallacy is, the origin of the belief is false. So it is true that many of us grew up and came to belief as part of our cultural heritage. But you know what? That is absolutely, utterly, totally irrelevant. Since how you came to belief doesn't say anything about whether or not that belief is true. If the belief is true, then it doesn't matter how you came to know it at all. It doesn't matter that it's part of our cultural heritage. Now, a good reply to this objection would be something like this. Why, yes, I had an easy time believing in Christianity because I was raised around it. But what's wrong with that? How does that make my belief false or untrue? If a person in India came to believe the same thing that I do, even though he wasn't raised in a Christian culture, how does that change anything? We both believe the same thing, don't we? One of us just had to work harder to get to the same belief. So if his belief is true, then my belief is also true. I just didn't have to work so hard to get at it. Now, once you learn to recognize the genetic fallacy, you can find some double duty to apply it to here. And in this list of objections, we can apply it to objection number 5. And objection number 5 is Christianity arose from an ancient and ignorant people who didn't have science. Well, that may or may not be true, but again, it's totally irrelevant to whether or not Christianity is true. If you think Christianity is untrue, then you need to supply a rational argument stating why you think so. So right there, 2 objections knocked out. Let's look at objection number 2. If God created the universe, who created God? Now, this is an interesting problem that some very famous and otherwise intelligent people have tossed out there as a defeater to belief in God. They typically misunderstand what the Christian's belief about creation is. And it's rather famously stated in something that's called the Kalam cosmological argument. And it has 3 parts. Part 1 says that whatever begins to exist has a cause. We tend to know that from experience in life. This building didn't happen, it had a cause. People built it. The universe began to exist, well, as we have seen in the lectures here earlier today. The Big Bang, so to speak, is an example of that, so we recognize that that's true. And the conclusion then is that the universe has a cause. Now, the mistake is that what they think they hear being said is that everything began to exist. Therefore, God had to begin to exist. That's not what's said. Neither Christians nor Jews ever believed God had a beginning. He has always been eternal, and in fact, the Bible doesn't even attempt to explain where God came from like other religions of the time did. It simply assumes that God exists and says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. No other explanation is ever needed or given. Philosophers recognize this as something they define God as a necessary being. God is a necessary being, and that's a long and complicated argument. But we just simply need to tell the person who is raising objection number 2 that he has misunderstood what traditional Judaism and Christianity or other arguments like the Kalam cosmological argument have stated. God has never not existed. He exists outside of time and space. He existed before the universe was created. He is eternal. The mistake is their part. Let's look at objection number 8 very briefly. History is full of mother-child Messiah cults, Trinity Godheads, and the like. Thus, the Christian story is a myth like the rest. Well, now, this again is a common myth. It was started back in the 19th century when scholars started doing comparative religion studies. And it was actually rather quickly discarded, and today it's primarily found on the internet and propagated in some crazy movie called Zeitgeist. And that movie draws false analogies, it uses poor history, it doesn't reflect the current state of scholarship, and it makes numerous other errors along the way. But it's atheist propaganda. One claim that it makes is that the Egyptian myth of Isis and Osiris is an example of a god being resurrected, just like in Christianity. And therefore that means that Christianity is just another one of these mythic religions you don't need to believe in. But when you actually stop and do the comparisons, you see that there really is no comparison. For example, in the myth, Osiris is killed and chopped into pieces, which Isis then has to find and reassemble. She finds all but one piece and is able to bring him back to life. But he dies again each fall and comes back to life again each spring. Now, the Isis and Osiris story is a myth to explain why the crops die off in the fall and why they sprout out again in the spring. This is what's known as a nature myth. And nature myths were common to the ancient world. But you know what? Nothing like this exists anywhere in the Bible. And the resurrection of Jesus doesn't happen every year. It doesn't bring spring or summer. Jesus is raised to life one time in a real and glorified body. His death was for the forgiveness of human sin, and it was to reconcile the world to God. That was something absolutely new in the ancient world. It was nothing like the Isis and Osiris myth at all. The Zeitgeist and the repeaters of Zeitgeist out there have gotten it completely wrong. The final thing I'll address tonight is a simple but common fallacy called the ad hominem fallacy. And this is an attack on a person. You can't believe that God is real just because a preacher told you so. Why, he's part of that inside crowd who wants to keep you ignorant and tied to the church so he can get your money and control you. This is kind of a nutshell atheist objection that you hear out there. Well, here you have several attacks going on. There is a slanderous conspiracy theory attack that's proposed here against the church and against preachers. It never, ever addresses the actual claim that God is real with any kind of an argument. Notice that it has no argument given for distrusting your preacher either. It's just a bunch of slanderous accusations. And even if your preacher were a control freak and part of a conspiracy to keep you tied to the church and to get your money, that doesn't mean that his claim that God is real is not true. It just means he's a highly flawed pastor. But the claim itself stands or falls on its own right, not because of the man who tells it to you. Charles Manson could tell it to you that God is real, and it would be just as factually true as if it was said by the Pope. Okay? Now, ad hominem fallacies are, again, attack against a person, not an evaluation of the truth of what that person has to say. And we can, again, apply this one, you get some double duty out of it, apply it back to objection number 5 again, which said Christianity arose from an ancient and ignorant people who didn't have science. And what we see is that this attacks the intelligence of the people and the way of their understanding the world. It does not actually deal with any of the truth claims of Christianity. It doesn't attempt to disprove that God exists or to deny the resurrection of Jesus. It essentially says, you shouldn't believe these people because they were stupid back then, and today we're not stupid. Well, so anyone raising this kind of objection would be guilty of an ad hominem attack and really should not be listened to. So if I could sum up what critical thinking is, it would be something like this. Helping people focus. Strip away all of the emotion, all of the flaws, and get down to what is really the issue. So many times people get sidetracked onto other issues when they get into these discussions. Make the person that you're dealing with stick to the topic. Look at the basic issue. Don't let it get away from you. Make sure that they have good arguments and good form for their arguments. Our churches need this discipline and education to fend off the attacks from these internet infidels, the atheists, secularists, and agnostics out there. The Jeffrey Radisson character was a nice composite of an academic atheist, and those people really do exist. Apologetics, like those demonstrated by the Josh Wheaton character, shores up the faith of people, and as you saw in the movie, one of the characters even came to faith in Jesus from it. People do find their spirits lifted and their faith refreshed when they realize that there are good arguments for God's existence. But most often they are not exposed to these ideas at church or at home. And I've known people who have crashed and burned during seminary and PhD programs because they lacked this type of thing. Now, Dr. Craig also has lots of stories about how pastors and students have had their faith renewed when they were taught these things, because it gave them a whole different perspective. Reasonable faith is highly engaged in critical thinking. It is a ministry targeted at church people, but particularly those who have or plan to pursue a university education. He's recently written some books for children. He's produced some church-level adult studies called On Guard. He continues to minister on university campuses with lectures and debates, and also through his academic writings. He's an expert in ways in which I can only wish to be. And all of us need to recognize that not everyone can be an expert in all of these matters, but you know what? It's important for you to know that there are resources out there to help you, no matter what level of education you're at the moment. Those of us who do apologetics want to help you get the resources and the answers that you need for these difficult questions. That's what we're here about. That's why we do these things, so that you have someone to turn to besides relying upon your own knowledge. So it's a group, it's a support group, and we are trying out there to help you salvage and maintain not only your faith, but the faith of the others around you, particularly the young. All right, question time. The chair recognizes Nick Peters of the Deeper Waters podcast.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple things and make a point. First off, I'd be amused to meet this person who thinks we're in it for the money. I assure you it is not there right now for us. And if anyone wants
Have you read the Da Vinci Codes?
Yeah, the Da Vinci joke, yes. If anyone wants to, I'd also be glad to talk with them afterwards about some of these things like the pagan copycat theory. It's rather hysterical. And I'm sure if you meet someone online who says there's no evidence that Jesus ever existed or anything like that, rest assured you're talking to someone totally clueless about history. And believe it or not, Richard Carrier is not really a respected scholar in the field. But since you're talking about critical thinking, I think it would be important to mention Peter Boghossian in his Treat Epistemologist.
Yes, Peter Boghossian has, you've done the more recent interviews with him, with people on his subject. Why don't you tell us about what his position is, because it's really interesting.
Peter Boghossian wrote a manual for creating atheists, which is in fact really a manual for creating ignorance. And I read it. I giggled quite a few times in it. For instance, he has even one point where he says, we talked about the arguments for God's existence have all been refuted. There's a footnote there, or an endnote rather. So I go check out, where is this great source that's refuted all these arguments? Not one source is given, not one refutation of an argument is given. He encourages people, when they're going out to talk to people about faith, to avoid facts, because these people are emotionally driven. And personally, he's avoided facts for quite a while too. And what he wants to do is even have a show called The Reason Whisperer, where he's going to come to your churches and interview people and try and deconvert them before a live audience, which I say, please come to my church, have those cameras running, and it will be a show you never forget. And what he wants to do is create an army of 10,000 street epistemologists. I have interacted with him in the past until he banned me from his Facebook page for some reason. And I've written some blogs on this at Deeper Waters, but one blog in particular that doesn't really mention Bogosian, but it's related to this, is one I recommend people read called Gentlemen, We Are at War. Because Bogosian is issuing a challenge right here, and if we do not know how to think, if we are not teaching people how to think, we are going to lose. Now, if the gospel isn't going to lose overall, it'll thrive somewhere else. But if we want to thrive in America, we have to do something now.
Yeah, I was interested to hear him on the Unbelievable podcast with Justin Riley, too, talking about how he's a professor, and so he claims, well, I've taught tens of thousands of students these things, and well, they can, what's his claim? They never can answer the question or something anyway. And it was just totally baseless factual hearsay, and that was pointed out in the debate so much so. But he is actually at war, like a lot of these people are. They're not satisfied anymore to simply sit back and say, we don't believe in God. If you want to believe in God, go ahead and have your little fairy tale, and if it makes you feel good. That's not where atheism is at today. It's now getting hostile, as the title of his book says.
One point we should say about that is you look at the diagnostic for mental disorders and such. I don't remember what its initials are right now, but Peter Bogosian wants it to be that if you are a person of faith, and he doesn't have a clue what faith really is, it's not blind belief, it's trust and belief. So he says, if you are one of those people, you need to be listed as having a mental disorder, and your condition, you need to be contained. Imagine what happens if someone who's trained by Bogosian comes into power in the higher office of government. It's coming if we don't get up and do something.
Yeah, and it's his definition of faith that he's always out there saying is not having something like not having any evidence. It's just a hope or a wish or some fairy tale pie in the sky thing that he wants to push on people, and that's not the Christian definition of faith. The Christian definition tells us that we have a real faith, a historical faith, that Jesus was raised from the dead, and we're going to be raised likewise. So Christianity is very historically based. I mean, you can't get around that, and that's one of the things that people who are critics of the church often overlook, is its historical background. From beginning to end, from Judaism on. I mean, it starts in the Old Testament. Any other questions on critical thinking? All right.
One of the things that bothers me when people say they don't believe in God, they turn their own intellect into a God. Think of that. Man has taken what God gave him, his brain, and made it into their God. These folks that don't believe in God, I don't think have ever experienced the answer to prayer like most of us have. Neither have they listened to God's advice and followed that advice and been so blessed as my wife and I have been. And I could tell you that story, but you don't have time for that, because God is so real. God is not dead, as we've seen tonight. Wow. These folks are big to be complimented by their depth of their study, the depth of their intellect, and they've given it all to God, and we certainly do thank them for coming. Two things I want you to remind you of. One is Ken Smith's Apologetics class. It's going to be at Dodson Memorial in September. I don't know the exact date.
Starts on the 11th.
Starts on the 11th. All right, write it down. Another is Hugh Ross will be here on October the 12th. You can get on our website and find out the exact times, because our good man Joel back in the booth is our website man, and he is way ahead of us old fogies when it comes to doing things for the electronic media. We thank you all so much for coming. Come back and visit us at any time. We have a wonderful family of believers here, as I'm sure you do at your home church. God bless you and good night.